I'm Andrew Merle, and this is the Andrew Merle Show. And it's a wonderful day indeed for me personally. For the past 5 years, as I talked about in episode 1 of my podcast, I've been involved with the city of St. George for about 5 years now. 5 years of volunteering, 5 years of showing up and doing interviews and press conferences, 5 years of being yelled at, called names, have insults hurled at me online, 5 years of legal work. Now, finally, the Louisiana Supreme Court has rendered a decision, and I'm just going to read it to you. So the city of St. George, we lost our bid to incorporate at the trial court level. The First Circuit Court of Appeal ruled against us, and last Friday we got the Louisiana Supreme Court's decision, and I was in the middle of a Chick-fil-A sandwich at lunch when I finally got the news that we had won. And the verdict says this: we find legal error, review the matter de novo, reverse the denial of incorporation, and render judgment in favor of the incorporators and electors. And so what that means is the Louisiana Supreme Court thought the First Circuit and the trial court ultimately erred in their ruling against us, that the opposition had not satisfied their burden and proven their case, and that St. George should be allowed to incorporate as a city. They reviewed the matter de novo, and what that means is they just looked at it all. There's usually a couple of different reasons why something can be looked at by a court of appeal or a Supreme Court. Was it abuse of discretion or manifest error? But in special cases, like the City of St. George case, the Supreme Court reviewed the entire record and ruled on the matter. And what did they rule? So first and foremost, they ruled, we'll talk about the things that St. George lost in this opinion. We had challenged a Metro Council member's right to challenge the incorporation without the authority of the council that he sits on. City of Baton Rouge, East Baton Rouge Parish, never authorized anybody to be a plaintiff in this lawsuit. They did it on their own volition with no authority from the governing body of which they serve. So one of the reasons we challenged that was we felt like you shouldn't have the ability as a government official to arbitrarily involve yourself in litigation that could affect the body you sit on. And in this case, the court said that Metro Council member did have standing to challenge whether the incorporation was reasonable and whether or not we could provide the services within a reasonable period of time. However, they did say that Metro Council member did not have the standing to challenge the petition that we had to sign and get 25% of the registered voter signatures, that he did not have the ability to challenge that petition and the contents thereof because he doesn't own property in the area, he doesn't vote in the area, he has no connection to the area, none of his district includes the area. So for that, he has no interest in how the petition got to the election process. So he wasn't allowed to challenge whether or not our plan was sufficient. Therefore, our plan was deemed sufficient. And looking at some of the other issues, if you read the Supreme Court opinion, it is available in a bunch of different places at this point. I'd recommend, if you want to get it from the source, the Louisiana Supreme Court website, you can download it right there and read it, just like the rest of us had to do it. And so the rest of the opinion is, pretty thorough. It's a very nice opinion. You can tell the Supreme Court justices did their homework. They reviewed the record, and they had several conclusions. So number one, and something that's been, I'll say misinformation to be kind about it, lies would probably be the correct terminology, is challenging that the city of St. George lacked enough revenue to provide the services to the citizens of St. George. And why that's been comical for so long now is the narrative is, well, in fact, this was something opposing counsel said at least twice, once at the First Circuit and once before the Louisiana Supreme Court. He said, we have to protect them from themselves. So in a process that's been over a decade long, and in a process at that point that was in year 4, you didn't know what you voted for when you voted October 12, 2019, according to the opposition. You were too dumb to vote for what you voted for. That was the argument. Don't look at me. And so one of the, I think, very poignant moments of the Supreme Court argument, Justice Crane says, well, sir, what makes you think that we're better suited sitting up here and not from that area? What makes you think we're better suited to tell them how to govern themselves than they are? And so a large portion of this Supreme Court opinion is dedicated to constitutional issues that we felt very strongly about. And you'll hear me talk a lot about constitutionality and the fundamentals of our freedom and our democracy. And I believe in episode 1, I think I probably went on a little rant about that. And it's true, and the opinion reflects that our right to self-determination and our right to self-governance is two of the foremost requirements, rights. They're fundamental. It's some of the foundations of our democracy. And if we're not able to determine our own self-governance, if we're not able to vote and have our lawful election stand, then what's left of the democracy that we live in? And so a lot of that is reflected by Justice Crane's opinion. So constitutionality was a large factor in the court's decision, because if you look at these fundamental rights and how they're being affected by the plaintiffs, you have to err. You have to give deference. You have to give a lot of latitude in favor of preserving a lawful election. Literally, the most important part of our democracy is our freedom to vote. So you have to err with caution. You have to give all the possible inclinations to preserving that election. So then the court went on to look at the provision of public services. One of the big parts in this series of laws, Louisiana Revised Statutes 33, essentially 1 through 5. And so one of the criteria that we were looking for, and one of the criteria the plaintiff challenged, was whether or not the city of St. George could timely provide the public services it aims to provide. Now, humorous as this is verbatim from that statute. And what's funny about it is the opposition never once offered any testimony or evidence whatsoever regarding the timeliness of services, whether we could actually provide those services within amount of time, or would there be a lapse? Now, if you want to do statutory interpretation, so for those of you not from Louisiana, or those of you who aren't legal nerds, we have a civil law system in Louisiana. The rest of the country has a common law system. Well, that civil law system says we have to look at the language of the statute to determine the laws, what's okay and what's not okay. And you have to do, when you do a legal analysis, you're supposed to, in Louisiana, doing a statutory analysis to find out what these words mean and the intent behind those words before you ever move on to looking at other cases. And in this case, the opposition never bothered to offer anything regarding how long it would take us to provide a service. And the reason they didn't is the answer was clear. Many of these services in St. George are provided according to millages, which we've talked about before. Millage is a fancy word that means property tax. Anytime you take my money from me and it goes to something that sounds governmental, that's a tax. But they call it millages. And so we pay a lot of these millages already on our property tax, and regardless of what you call our area, which I now call it St. George, I've called it St. George for a while, regardless of what area you live in, those property taxes are not going to change. So we're always paying for the library, we're paying for the park system, we're paying for the sheriff's office. Right now we're paying for an EBR parish school tax. There's a nice breakdown on your property tax if you go to the tax assessor's website, and you can find out all these different things you pay for. And we do. And that's not going to change. And so the reason the opposition doesn't offer testimony is many of these services are already taken care of. They're already provided. There'll be no disruption of service. There'll be complete continuity because for the most part, for example, I'll give you animal control. I'll say animal control and right now mosquito abatement. There's a good possibility that the city of St. George would look to stay in those services with the parish. It's beneficial to the parish. It's probably beneficial to the city of St. George to not have to roll out and create a pound and an animal control service. Okay? So hypothetically looking at that, we would maintain that service within the parish, continue paying for that service. The check would just be written for our portion from the city of St. George. And so they never looked at those issues. In fact, they never went as far as to really challenge our ability to provide services whatsoever, because they knew that we had the ability to do so with the revenue that we were going to generate. All parties stipulated to what the revenue for the area would have been or was in 2017, essentially, which was $48.3 million annually. That number was approximate from our group. It was approximated from their group. I believe the legislative auditor had done a fiscal note on it previously, and the number is $48.3 million. It is higher now because sales tax collections have risen. Things have gotten more expensive. The tax collections have gotten more expensive. But $48.3 million was the rough number everyone went with at trial. So what they did do, what they attempted to do, was muddy the water continuously in the opposition as to how much services would cost for the city of St. George. Now, you would think, I'm just going to be logical thinker here, that the way to prove how much the services cost in St. George would have been to put on testimony from somebody in the finance department of East Baton Rouge Parish. Somebody in there has to know how much East Baton Rouge Parish pays to provide all these services to the city that would become St. George, the area of St. George, right? They're going to put a bunch of testimony on that shows just how expensive it is to run that area. Well, you'd be wrong. In fact, the testimony and evidence, their own witness, a finance director for East Baton Rouge Parish, testified she didn't know. There was no record. There was no way to find out how much the services cost for that particular area. She not only did not know, she had never looked into it, and she'd never been asked to do so. Right? And this is weird to me because the opposition has argued all along that the effect of St. George incorporating would devastate the East Baton Rouge Parish area, in particular, the city of Baton Rouge. Well, how's it going to devastate you if we don't know how much anything costs? And this has been part of their PR campaign was, oh, don't worry about what the things cost because we don't know either. Just think of it as they're taking $48.3 million away from us, and the Supreme Court caught it. I almost say proud. They're Supreme Court justices, right? You expect them to be well read and smart, and you hope and do the right thing, but they caught it, and they caught the argument that, well, they're taking $48.3 million from Baton Rouge. We're going to be bankrupt. In fact, opposing counsel argued if St. George were allowed to leave and take its $48.3 million, the city of Baton Rouge would no longer be able to take care of the drainage and the roadways. I mean, he created the Mad Max Thunderdome scenario if St. George is allowed to leave. And the judges on the Supreme Court caught it. But wait a second. They're taking $48.3 million. That's an agreed upon number. So we know that's true. But guess what? The city of St. George would also be taking all the services that you currently provide to them. And if they're taking the services to provide to their citizens and you no longer have to provide those services, then you don't have to pay to provide those services. There's a cost savings. And so this was a humorous argument opposing counsel has made for many years. And I should start saying the plaintiffs. I'm irritated with opposing counsel for a million reasons, but really the plaintiffs. So this is a humorous argument they've made for a long time. The St. George leaving, St. George is going to go bankrupt. Now, the absurdity of that argument would be if you thought you could get rid of a debt, something that was costing you more than you were getting for it. If you in your personal life could get rid of a debt, would you fight it? Would you sue over it? Would you spend $1 million in legal fees to have a 4-year lawsuit over it? Hell no, you wouldn't do that. That doesn't make any sense. And this court caught it. It doesn't make any sense. You're telling me that these folks are going to be bankrupt on day one, in a deficit from day one, if they're allowed to incorporate. Oh, yes, absolutely, Your Honors. Then why aren't you letting them leave? You should be helping them pack. You should be enthusiastic about this. This is great. So they caught it, and they said, no, they're taking not just the amount of money they make, they're taking the amount it costs to provide them services, which they couldn't even prove at trial because they refused to put on testimony as to what our services cost. Sidebar, not in the opinion, personal opinion. They did this for a reason, because if the public, especially in the city of St. George, found out what we've been saying all these years, is that we've been subsidizing the city of Baton Rouge and their services and paying for services that frankly aren't even allowed to be rendered in St. George because they're for the city of Baton Rouge. If the citizens found out just how little Baton Rouge paid to maintain our area, or for lack of a better word, not maintain our area, we would be horrified, angry. So they caught that. And then they said, okay, so and hypothetically, let's go down this road. Your expert, the plaintiff's expert, said he couldn't do an analysis on what it cost to run St. George because he didn't have that data. So what he did was he used other cities that were out there. Hypothetically, what it costs to run cities, looking at other cities around the state and the country's budgets. Comparable cities, he says. Well, if you're going to do that, number one, and the court caught this as well, and the court said, well, that's funny that you're looking at other cities because really, if St. George has got this pot of revenue and it's got these expenses, wouldn't the better comparison be St. George running itself versus Baton Rouge providing those services? But again, Baton Rouge couldn't tell you how much those services cost. So they had to do some make-believe and fantasy, and they went out and looked at other cities. Now then, when they did look at these other cities, they didn't properly extrapolate the services that are provided by a sales tax versus the services provided by a property tax. You see, that's the misnomer. We have $48.3 million in sales tax revenue, but if you add in our contributions to the property tax bill, you know, those services that are parish-wide, our portion that goes into that, our city budget's not $48.3 million. It's actually more like $120 to $130 million. But they did not do that. Instead, their expert only looked at our sales tax revenue versus other cities which use property and sales tax revenue to comprise their budget. And the court caught that as well. In fact, one of our best arguments, I thought, at the Supreme Court was looking at their numbers and saying, hey, you know what? We're looking at their numbers, and there's one that stuck out like a sore thumb, and it's a nice paragraph in the Supreme Court opinion, and it talks about unfunded pension liability. That just sounds like something boring, but what it is how much do you owe to your retirees? Right? Unfunded pension liability. And all along, we were told, years the opposition told us how much we were not going to pay for this. We were walking away, trying to stoke fear into employees of the city parish that their retirement was not going to be paid for because St. George was leaving. And lo and behold, leading up to the election, October 12th of 2019, the St. George organizers sat down with the parish retirement system and negotiated an ordinance to calculate how much St. George would owe if we won and we were incorporated. We worked with the retirement system. The city parish refused to participate and refused to send anyone. So we get this ordinance passed prior to the election. So it sounds like to me, not only is St. George going to pay our fair share of pension liability, we actually went to find out what it was and to make sure we knew what it was. So the Supreme Court, for the first time a court in the St. George litigation, said, your expert plaintiff didn't look at that ordinance, didn't revise his study to reflect the actual amount that the ordinance says St. George is going to pay? And plaintiff had to answer, no, he did not. So what they were arguing was, well, we know that $48.3 million is the St. George revenue number, and our expert says the St. George expected expenses is going to be $51 million. That leaves St. George at a $3 million deficit. Now, mind you, I don't think the statute that challenges incorporation says whether or not we have enough money or not it is the definition of reasonableness. I think it could be a component factor, but it's not a definitive factor. And there's other reasons why it wouldn't matter anyway. But in this scenario, say we went to the Supreme Court and we actually said, hey, you know what? If you want to use their plaintiff's numbers for our expenses, that's okay. Let's do this. Let's just revise his number on that unfunded pension liability, because you see their expert had opined that it would cost us $8.9 million a year for 30 years to pay our portion of the unfunded pension liability. And the problem is, another witness for the plaintiff, the finance director for EBR Parish, said, oh no, that's not the number. That formula says it's $5.1 million over 15 years. Well, wait a second. He said our expenses were going to be $51 million. That's with that $9 million number in there. But the truth is, it's $4 million less. So what the Supreme Court looked at and said, hey, you know what? If we change the number that's admittedly wrong by their witness, St. George is going to operate at a surplus on the first day. And then if you actually read the ordinance, which apparently prior courts and some other folk and the plaintiffs never did, if you read the ordinance, we don't even owe the money for the first 2 years to allow the city to get its foundation under it, get its revenue straight. So on year 3, we start paying our unfunded pension liability. So we don't even owe the $5 million for year 1 or year 2. It's not due till year 3. So we're running a surplus using their numbers on year 1. We're running a major surplus using their numbers if we're paying it correctly on year 3. So clearly, and the court did rule this, the city of St. George is going to have plenty of revenue to provide its parish services. So the other component part of this is how we adversely impact the city of Baton Rouge. So on your reasonableness determination, it was, I guess the courts have decided that reasonableness must include pretty much solely whether or not we have enough money. Because no one looked at how timely it would be. No one looked at what a service should comprise. No one looked at what reasonableness could possibly mean outside of money. Like, could we bid the project out? Could we actually get someone to do the work? What's a reasonable time frame to have that done? They didn't look at that because there's already a law addressing all of that. The St. George Transition District actually provides a mechanism for the transition of services from the city parish of East Baton Rouge to the city of St. George, and gives a 1 to 2 year duration for all those negotiations to happen, all those contracts to be signed, whether that is us continuing with the parish service or bidding out our own services and going a different direction. And it even allows us taxing authority to collect the money, tax revenue during that time to pay for those services. So if you take the law out that's already in place, I guess you can only look at what the hypothetical revenue versus expenses would be. So then the court looked at our detriment. Are we adversely detrimental? Are we adversely impacting the city of Baton Rouge? No other city challenged us in the lawsuit. Central is also in East Baton Rouge Parish, so is Zachary and Baker. None of those cities challenged our incorporation. And in fact, what is also noted by this court is the city of Baton Rouge didn't challenge us either. Not one person with authority from the governing authority of East Baton Rouge Parish. If you don't believe me, you go to their website for the Metropolitan Council in East Baton Rouge Parish, and I believe it's line 1. The Metropolitan Council is the governing authority for East Baton Rouge Parish. Not one time did any authorization to file suit to challenge the incorporation even appear on the agenda for discussion, much less did it go to a vote, much less was someone authorized to be in the lawsuit. And that was noted by the court. So if you're telling me a municipality is adversely impacted, shouldn't that municipality approve a challenge to the lawsuit? Shouldn't they be the ones that say we're adversely impacted? But they didn't. But hypothetically, let's go down that road. what did the Supreme Court say about St. George's adverse impact on the city of Baton Rouge? Well, here's what happened. How do you prove it? Well, you got to prove it through testimony, evidence, exhibits, witnesses, experts, somebody. And they provided none. They could not tell you how St. George would impact the city of Baton Rouge, going back to earlier. Why? They never tracked our expenses. Their sole argument was that we were taking $48.3 million, and that's devastating, and it's going to result in all these budget cuts. It even went so far as they proposed that it would cost 20% of each department's budget if St. George were allowed to incorporate. However, when the witnesses were asked, did you ask the basis for that? No, they did not. Were they given a reason for that? No. Were they provided with any numbers to support it? No. I mean, for example, the Baton Rouge Police Department, the chief at the time, who's no longer there, was asked about a budget cut, and he talked about how devastating the city of St. George would be on the Baton Rouge police budget. Now, I want to tell you real quick, because I live in the city of St. George, the Baton Rouge City Police Department does not service any of the St. George area, any of the unincorporated area. They are confined to the city limits of Baton Rouge. There is a road. I live near the border of St. George. There is a road called Essen Lane. They will turn around right there. They do not come into my neighborhood. They do not come into my area. They will not. They will not service or help me or whatsoever. I have to call the sheriff's office if I need something. They're not coming. Same with Baton Rouge Fire Department. I'm impacting the Baton Rouge Fire Department in St. George, allegedly. A fire department that cannot come to my house to put out a fire because we have our own fire department, the St. George Fire Department. So question being asked was, well, why are we impacting these services like Baton Rouge Fire, Baton Rouge Police that don't provide us service? Answer: the city of Baton Rouge has been using your tax dollars in the city of St. George to subsidize its operation and services for a very long time. You have literally been the piggy bank for the city of Baton Rouge's slush fund. And it came out, and one of the justices correctly noted and asked, so you're telling me if the city of St. George leaves and takes its sales tax revenue with it, that you're not able to, again, according to opposing counsel, clean the ditches, mow the roadways, maintain services, catastrophe, disaster, apocalypse? Opposing counsel, well, that's right. That's correct. And again, the justice came back and said, well, so what you're telling me is that these people have been paying for somebody else's stuff for a long time. It's not and the court in this opinion has ruled, it's not an adverse impact that citizens in one area want to take their money back when they're paying for something they are not getting. That's not adverse impact. And then they went through. There was a very nice, it's actually not a Louisiana case. It's a Mississippi case. Again, this is a very unique section of law that really has only been challenged one time previously, and not to this length, not to this depth, and definitely not to this expense. There's a Mississippi case where they looked at a 14-point test to kind of walk through an area that wants to incorporate to see if it kind of fits the definition. Is it truly a area that should be and wants to be a city, and can they do city things? And so through this test, all 14 points, every single one favored the city of St. George incorporating. At the end of this decision, when I tell you literally, there is not one factor that favored the plaintiffs that would deny the city of St. George's incorporation. Not a one. This Supreme Court determined, A, St. George is going to have enough money. B, there's no one in the lawsuit challenging us that has standing to challenge the sufficiency of the petition. I mean, look at what the alleged government actor was trying to accomplish with that. Challenging the petition that we had citizens sign to get us on the ballot to vote for St. George. When did he challenge it? Did he challenge it when we had the petition certified by the Secretary of State? He did not. Did he challenge it when the Registrar of Voters was counting signatures to see if we had enough? He did not. Did he challenge it when the governor set it for a special election and said we'd fulfilled all the requirements? No, he did not. Did he challenge it before the election? No, he did not. You see, there's a pattern developing. No, instead he waited until after you went to the ballot and you voted, whether you voted for us or against us. He waited till after that to challenge whether or not the petition you signed informed you accurately of what we were trying to accomplish, which has been, I believe, the First Circuit decision, I believe, was a misinterpretation of the intent of that statute when it was passed. But hey, let's not get into that. The Supreme Court opinion says we're good. And so you look at this opinion, it's very lengthy, it's very thorough. It tells you outright. And something else this opinion did is something we've talked about a long time. When talking about how much it costs to operate the city of St. George, this court said, and the fun part was them defaulting to, hey, even if we use the plaintiff's numbers, St. George is still going to have a surplus on year one. But that's a hypothetical where we keep repeating the same mistakes and doing the same things over and over again, which I'll tell you all day long, and I said it several times in the first podcast, that's insanity. And the court noted that this group, the St. George citizens, want to do things differently. We want to provide more efficient services. We want to provide better services, cost-effective services. And in doing so and doing things differently, we may not incur the same level of debt. I'll flash back. I told you in the beginning, Baton Rouge, $1.1 billion budget this year. 2/3 of that budget's tied up in pension debt and bond debt. Baton Rouge has a lot of old debt they're continuing to pay for that St. George, outside of the unfunded pension liability, will not have. And if we're going to do things different with our public-private partnership moving forward, we will not accrue that giant pension number. We will accrue a surplus instead, because we're not going to have a dearth of city employees sitting around collecting paychecks and then pensions. We're going to have private contractors doing a lot of the work. And if those private contractors pay for retirement or 401ks or whatever, that's their problem. It's not a legacy cost that the city of St. George is going to have to bear. So the court was correct in reasoning that, hey, even with their numbers, St. George is going to make money on year one, but most likely, because of the business model they're going to employ in St. George, we are never going to accrue some of those costs. It's not just the cost of the services today. It's the legacy of how much you pay for it. It's how much you pay to maintain equipment. It's who fixes the equipment. All these things that go into these big old governments. Well, St. George is not likely to have that. It's not our business model. And the court pointed out that it's likely, if they use a different model, they may have significantly more savings, and that our number, because originally we went through and created a budget for the city of St. George, doing the best we can to extrapolate from the parish convoluted budget what expenses and costs are for the city of St. George. Isn't that ironic that by the time we get to trial with the city of St. George, our organizers have a better idea of how much Baton Rouge was spending to run St. George services than the city of Baton Rouge or the parish of East Baton Rouge had for itself, because they weren't keeping track. We extrapolated that number. We even padded that number a little bit and added some extra money to give the sheriff some money in case we wanted to provide some new services. So we even padded the stats to try to get the biggest amount of expenses we could to give a liberal estimate to what it would cost to run St. George, and we got stuck at $32 million. Now, if our agreed upon revenue for year one in St. George, according to 2017, was $48.3 million, and the best we could find expense-wise was $32 million, providing the same level of service that currently exists in Baton Rouge. So our revenue, $48.3 million. Simple math even I can do. Subtract $32 million. We're running at over a $16 million surplus on year one. And we feel good about that number. Is it just us making numbers up in a vacuum? It's not. This is also borne out by the City of Central case. Central, our neighbor next door that incorporated 15 years ago, I believe. They found the same thing out. They started with a very modest little budget, I think under $2 million. They're now around $8 million. They have $80 million in the bank in reserves. So over that 15-year time period, they have acquired quite a budget surplus. And that's what they found out. They found out that they were giving more money to East Baton Rouge Parish than they were getting back in services rendered in their area. One of the reasons they incorporated. So the history bears out, the math bears out, even using their flawed math, and the math looks extremely favorable to, well, I'll say extremely favorable to the city of St. George. The surplus was so great when we went through and looked at the budget. Our concern was, it looks like we're taking money from Baton Rouge because they've been taking $16 million of our dollars every year and using it for whatever they wanted. And so the court did opine that even if we used the business model we could increase our savings. So another thing that the opposition argued was some fuzzy math about where these cuts in the budget would come from. They kept throwing, the eventual argument was that we would affect 50% of the budget with taking our $48.3 million in sales tax away. $48.3 million of a $1.1 billion budget. Let that sink in. Our opposition argued we were going to cut 50% of the budget. Our $48.3 million minus $1.1 billion. That's the mathematicians we were working against. And so in that process, they kept coming up with these different scenarios. Okay, well, let's look and say that the general fund, which is where the $48.3 million that we would be taking comes from, not the specifically allocated fund, the general fund, is $320 million. And what they tried to do from that point was go, well, out of that general fund, $214 million can't be cut because some of it's mandated or super difficult to reduce. So it's only $106 million that can completely be reduced, and they're taking $48.3 million of it. Okay, so that's how they got to their 50% number. So you're telling me we're going to cripple you by taking $48.3 million from the $106 million that has no purpose whatsoever in your budget. It's not unreducible. It ain't difficult to reduce. It's just the last $106 million that has nowhere else to go. And we're going to take that number, and you're still going to argue you're adversely impacted. In fact, you're still going to argue that you're going to have all these 20% cuts to all these different departments. And I believe the Supreme Court landed where we felt all along. The city parish officials in this lawsuit are disingenuous and probably dishonest. Then you look to see, they went through the 14-factor test that Mississippi's court has laid out for an incorporation, and they looked at it and they determined that every factor favors incorporation. In fact, they argued at some point in this opinion that the incorporation of St. George may not only not adversely impact Baton Rouge, it may help Baton Rouge, which is what we've been arguing for a long time now, is if you look at the overall numbers, and the court did, who's growing in East Baton Rouge Parish? The city of Zachary, whose school district broke off years ago and became one of the top 5, top 10 performing school districts in the state. The city of Central, perennial top 3 school district now in the state. The city of Central also incorporated a city, and budget has quadrupled in that time frame. The population has increased in that time frame. Its contributions to the city parish budget have increased in that time frame. And the city of St. George has grown because our incorporation's been on the table this entire time. So our population's grown. Who has not grown in Baton Rouge? The city of Baton Rouge. Our parish in general is on a population decline. And when your population declines, your sales tax revenue declines because you have less people in the area shopping. When there's less people in the area, period, they have less businesses in the area. I'm a small business owner. I own my own little private law firm. If I were to move out to Livingston or Ascension or some suburb, some other parish, I'm more likely to, one, spend my dollars in that area, eating at restaurants, shopping at their businesses, kids attending school. All these things have an impact for that parish. But I might also relocate my business to that parish. Right now, I live in St. George. My business is located in the city limits of Baton Rouge. So they're getting my money, my tax revenue, my occupational license fees every year. So there's a benefit to Baton Rouge for me to be here. So the overall long-term effect of St. George is if we continue to do what we say we're going to do, and if we continue on a path that looks even remotely similar to Central and or Zachary, then our population will continue to grow. And if our population continues to grow, the property values will rise. If our population continues to grow, our sales tax revenue will grow. More people in the area spending money. More people working in the area means more businesses in the area, which means more tax revenue there. So as the court correctly pointed out, there's a better chance of St. George being a net positive for Baton Rouge than a negative. So at the end of this Supreme Court opinion, it's restated once again that incorporation of St. George is happening. Really the culmination of a long time of work. In fact, let me read it again. I like to read it. We reverse the lower court's denial of incorporation and render judgment in favor of proponents. Here's the conclusion that they wrote. I'll read the whole paragraph because, it's a podcast. I got time. Cole has the statutory right to challenge the incorporation of St. George. However, his real and actual interest is limited to the adverse impact incorporation will have on Baton Rouge, a municipality in the vicinity, and whether St. George can timely provide services. Despite the challenge, we conclude St. George can provide public services within a reasonable period of time. Applying objective factors to determine reasonableness, we hold incorporation is reasonable. We reverse the lower court's denial of incorporation and render judgment in favor of proponents. So that's the decision. So as of Friday, officially, St. George, the city, is officially incorporated. What is next? Anytime you have big news, you have a large accomplishment. The very, very, very first thing you start hearing immediately following is, well, what's next? So what is next? One, there's a St. George Transition District. I've mentioned it. It was passed into law a few years ago. It provides a St. George Transition District Board whose sole purpose is to help the transition from City of Baton Rouge, East Baton Rouge Parish, to the City of St. George. That transition includes transferring services or entering into agreements to cooperate on services. This could be any number of areas from the parish. It could also include the sheriff's office if we want additional services beyond what the sheriff currently provides. And by the way, this is another department of misinformation from our opponents over the last several years. They have repeatedly insisted that the city of St. George would have no sheriff's protection, and we're not going to have a police department, that it would just be lawless Wild West out in St. George. Now, this despite a press release previously from the sheriff himself saying that's not true, and testimony saying I will continue to provide the same level of services I always have provided in the area because those folks pay property taxes in St. George. But this court went further and said not only is the sheriff going to provide those services to the city of St. George, he really doesn't have an option. One, they pay property taxes for his services. Two, he's got a constitutional mandate to provide them. It's not optional. It's not discretionary. It doesn't matter if the sheriff changes his mind in the future. The Constitution mandates he has to provide these services. And many communities all across the country, not just the state, but in our state in particular, have gone away from multiple policing agencies in the same parish because it's generally inefficient. There's generally redundancy and duplication of services, so additional cost for the same thing. And you got a sheriff's office with an elected official, a sheriff, who's accountable to the voters. So if you don't like how your law enforcement's being conducted, you simply vote them out at the next election. So for all these reasons, there's many communities in our state who have disbanded their local police departments or do without altogether and rely solely on the sheriff's department to provide services. They've tried to argue repeatedly that that would not happen in St. George. It's a constitutional mandate. It can't be any more clear than that. In addition, and what has been proven over and over again is if St. George is operating at a surplus, we've actually previously included in our budget a line item for additional sheriff services that if we wanted to, we could supplement the services. And according to the sheriff, if they want more services, they just got to pay for them. So if we wanted additional deputies, additional patrols, additional substations in the city of St. George only, we can pay extra for that. But we're not going to get less than we've got now. So what is next for the city of St. George? Well, one, we have a St. George transition district that transfers services, enters into contracts. Also, we are the bridge for the taxing authority for that 2% sales tax. It's been levied by East Baton Rouge Parish for our area. During this period of time, it is going to transfer to the St. George Transition District, where the Transition Board is going to allocate those funds to pay for services, allocate those funds to pay for the things we need to transition from East Baton Rouge Parish to the city of St. George. So that group has a 1-year permit under the law with an additional year if necessary. So up to 2 years to negotiate and transfer services. Could be drainage, could be roadways, really anything that runs the gamut of a city service that you've thought of would be under the purview of that transition district. And two, the governor's next got a job to do. He's got to appoint the first mayor and city council, the interim mayor and city council. They're not elected. They're appointed by statute. He will do so likely within the next 30 days, if not sooner. And at that point, that mayor and city council's job is to begin the process of ordinances, all the foundational aspects of a city, a lot of which we've been working on for quite a while now. So everything from ordinances, planning, permitting, and zoning, big issues in the city of St. George, that will be under the purview of the mayor and city council, and really determining how we want our government structure to look moving forward. What do you envision as the city of St. George governance model? We have talked ad nauseum for a long time now about being a different kind of city that we've ever had in Louisiana, and doing so in a manner that we can keep in place for generations. You know, the old business model, the bloated government model, it doesn't work. It's failing everywhere. It continues to repeat the same mistakes, and because it's so big, it can't undo itself. Well, our goal is to put in place a governance model that can't be undone, that eliminates the possibility for some of those mistakes in the future. Now, you can't eliminate all mistakes. People are human, and politicians are politicians. So this is where the accountability portion comes in. We don't want the all-seeing, all-powerful mayor. We don't want a mayor who is solely the person in charge of putting out the budget, the person in charge of selecting all these different offices. We don't want the end-all, be-all mayor, the iron-fisted mayor who rules dictator style, king style, queen style. We don't want that. We want a mayor who's more of a function of a city council. And by more of a function, I mean a mayor that sits on and votes with the city council. Your governing authority is one and the same. Our mayor will function essentially as a mayor pro tem, will run the agenda, run the meetings. When things are voted on and approved, that mayor will sign those documents, cut those checks, all the things that goes into the authorization portion, but the authority will come through a combined effort of the mayor and the city council. That would include a proposed budget for the city. That will include contracting and bidding out for services. They'll have a vote, just like the city council members do. They will effectively be a member of the city council as a mayor pro tem. So if you're looking at the city of St. George and you want to know, hey, what the hell are they doing? Envision this, a 5-person city council. Of those 5, there will be 3 specific districts. There'll be one at-large district that will function as a assistant mayor, mayor pro tem, and then the 5th, the at-large district, final at-large district will be your city mayor. That mayor will sit and preside over city council meetings. The days of mayors and city councils not working together, not being at meetings together, not having a lot of discussions is over. These groups will be one and the same. And envision this, a mayor, do you want your politician, your smiley, handshaking, baby-kissing politician running a day-to-day business for your city? No. And why is that? It hasn't worked. For every good mayor you have that can do that, you wind up with at least 2 to 3 who are completely inept and out of their water. And frankly, they just don't do it. So in this case, we're going to be a city manager style of government. And as a city manager style of government, a city manager will be hired and appointed by the mayor and city council together, will be given a contract to perform these services to run the day-to-day operations of the city. So when you have a drainage issue, when you have a pothole issue, you would wind up reporting it. It would filter its way to the city manager who would address these issues because that's all the city manager is going to do. Handle the day-to-day operations of the city. And what this does is it frees your mayor and city council up for what I believe their role should be. Oversight and accountability. Are the services being provided as we were told by the city manager, as provided in the contract with the contractor? Are the citizens getting what they paid for? Are the citizens happy? Address these issues because accountability is and an oversight should be the primary function of this mayor and city council. But also your mayor is going to be a full-time employee. So while they're serving on the city council, they also, because they're not running the day-to-day operations, they're your cheerleaders, they're your economic development drivers. They should be going out in our community, not just cutting ribbons, but asking businesses and citizens, hey, how are you doing? How are we doing? What would you like to see? Because one thing we've seen a lot of in East Baton Rouge Parish and South Louisiana in general over the past, I'll say 15, 20 years, is we have an amazing ability here to create these homegrown businesses from the start, from scratch. Raising Cane's. Todd Graves is a billionaire, right? You don't get much more successful than Todd Graves has been selling chicken fingers, right? That business was raised here. I went to Cane's #1 in 1996 when I started college. Wish I'd have known more about how it was going to turn out. And his headquarters is in Dallas. So we got another one, Walk-Ons, Brandon Landry. Awesome job, man. He's putting like 40 of those things in the Houston area. Walk-Ons, good food, good time, good concept. And it's hugely successful. Bye. See ya. Welcome to Atlanta, Georgia, headquarters of Walk-Ons. You have Smoothie King, headquartered in New Orleans, leaving. Amedisys, Albemarle. You have company after company that began here. You didn't have to go out and give them incentives. You didn't have to go out and beg them to come here. You didn't have to give them the old sales pitch. Yay, BR. You had them. And you lost them. Now, why is that? Republic Finance actually came out, I believe it was last year before last, moved their headquarters to Dallas and said, man, I just wish somebody would have talked to me about what we can do better, how to stay here. He wanted to stay here. And we let him go. We didn't even try. For some reason, Baton Rouge seems to think that economic development means going out and hunting somebody down and begging them to come here, lying to them about statistics, and let's give them some tax incentives and call it a day, and maybe they'll show up. And then you go out there, and to do that, you have to compete against every other city that's either bigger and more resources than you are, or similarly situated cities doing the same sales pitch you're doing, instead of, why don't we grow and award and communicate with our existing clientele, our existing businesses? We have a huge advantage in this area. You know, anytime somebody tells me they relocated their major corporation somewhere else because of the talent pool, is doing a disservice to our region, because we have a huge talent pool. It's a major university right here in Baton Rouge, LSU. Hey, I'll tell you, we have Southern University right across town as well, another major university. We have Baton Rouge Community College, very well thought of, very well funded community college. We have a ton of talent in this area. We just aren't giving it anything to do. We're just not focusing that talent. In fact, we're giving it reasons to leave every single day by doing PR campaigns instead of doing the heavy lifting and trying to solve any of these issues. So back to what's coming next, I believe our mayor should be a part of that process, the economic development driver for the city of St. George, a voting member of the city council, the mayor pro tem effect where they're preparing the agenda for the meetings, presiding over the meetings, the person who ultimately signs checks, and as part of the city council, their job is oversight, accountability, and coming up with the big concepts, right? We're going to do capital projects in St. George in the future, probably replace some roadways, I'll bet. Replace a lot of signage, I'll bet. And this is where they come in, where they can put some of those big concepts and project items and start doing some wish list thinking. Meanwhile, the city manager is handling all that day-to-day stuff that they are more than qualified to do, and the city council can make sure that city manager is doing the job they're paid for. And the best part about it is, if the city manager is not living up to the contract, or if one of these contractors is not performing as contracted, you fire them. And you can't do that in the old form of government, right? You can't. But in the new government, it's as easy as terminating a contract for non-performance, rebidding out the service. So I'm looking forward to great things. That's what's next for the city of St. George. We have to create a master plan, and that's where you come in. So for everyone who's opposed to us or doesn't like us, or if you've been there since day one, now you have a chance to be the beginning of your city. So if you don't like what I'm pitching, that's great. That's your prerogative. Come to meetings, be a part of the process, throw out your ideas. Give us something to look different to look at, and let's talk about it and vote. Because going back to, thank God St. George was not overturned. Elections have meaning, and you can vote in a mayor and city council that reflects your viewpoints on how a government should be run. So, unique opportunity, even if you hate me, even if you hate St. George, or you hate everything I've talked about today, you have the opportunity to create a city from scratch. Let's hear it. Stop typing on our Facebook page about how dumb we are, how ignorant we are, how racist we are. Quit doing all that. All you're doing is throwing out rhetoric and PR the opposition sold you years ago that had nothing to do with the reality of why we were being opposed. The reality of why we were being opposed is a group wanted to continue the status quo. They wanted to keep doing whatever it is they wanted to do, whether it's get permits. The permitting process in Baton Rouge takes about 6 to 9 months to get a permit to build a shed in your backyard. Some of these gentlemen can build 400 house neighborhoods in that time, and they get permits 5 minutes before they ask for it. They want to maintain that level of power and strength and manipulation over the system. And they viewed St. George as a challenge to that power, and that's why they threw out all the rhetoric and all the narrative. So if you call us racist, then you better believe the Advocate and the census for 2020 says St. George is the fastest minority growing population in the parish. So what's next? Public meetings, public agendas, a lot of comments on the master plan. And then, of course, after the governor appoints the mayor and city council for the interim, he will set an election at some point in the future to elect the first elected mayor and city council, and also transfer the taxing authority from the St. George Transition District to the city of St. George, and hopefully, in my opinion, also elect to have a home rule charter for the city of St. George, which will reflect what I've told you I believe is the best path forward as a mayor and city council and a form of governance. So that's it in a nutshell. That's the city of St. George, incorporated on Friday, although next question to ask is, when was St. George incorporated? It's not listed in the Louisiana Supreme Court opinion. It's not. And my belief is because the election itself was not challenged, they stipulated it was a lawful election. They weren't challenging the results. They weren't challenging the process. Because they weren't successful, I believe the city of St. George was incorporated on November 23rd, 2019, which is about 30 days after the election results were posted and certified that we had won incorporation. That's a big date and probably a source of contention here in the near future, part of the next steps process. Also, later on, people talk about how can I annex into the city of St. George. Give it a minute. Let's get the government up and running. See what you paid for. Make sure you're good with it. And the process will be very easy to follow and easy to outline. That if you're contiguous to the city of St. George and you want to annex in, at some point when there's a mayor and city council, that process will be outlined, made available, and you will have the ability to apply and move forward with that. I don't believe in giving you any false hope or promises. We just got incorporated on Friday. We don't have a mayor and city council appointed yet. Let's get ready to move forward, get the foundation created, and then go from there. So thank you very much for the volunteers, the supporters, the organizers, the committee, all the people that have worked tirelessly for over a decade to make the city of St. George happen. You are amazing. Many of you, in fact, all of you, were strangers when this process started. And it feels like a family reunion when we get together now, like old friends, old hat. So it's fun to be a part of this team. It's fun to be a part of this process. Moving forward, we've talked about it. I talked about it on Friday. This is not the end of St. George. It's just a part of the process. We're now beginning our city. So thank you. Look forward to working with you in the future, whether you supported us, whether you hated us. Come to the table and be a part of the future. The future is now, and it's the city of St. George. I am Andrew Merle. Thank you for listening to The Andrew Merle Show.